listening to Para X.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to another edition of Stirring the Cauldron here, where else, on the Para X Radio Network. Now, tonight's opening song is called Deep Trouble by Midnight Syndicate, and that plays into the show's theme tonight because we're going to be talking about haunted prisons with my guest, Corvis Nocturnum. And as we all know, you have to be in deep trouble to end up in prison in the first place, and probably even deeper trouble than that if you stick around there after you've died. So if you think about it, death should be the ultimate freedom, but it seems that that's not always the case. Now, Corvis is an author, a publisher, and lecturer who has written over a dozen books on popular culture. The contents range from vampires and zombies to the devil and the occult, and he's also an artist who lectures at conventions and universities on other subjects like secret societies, goth culture, and he does his best to debunk the many myths and stereotypes prevalent about dark subcultures, and he's also the founder of Dark Moon Press. Corvis, I could keep talking about you for like an hour, so I'm just cutting to the chase. Hello.
Hello, Marla. Wonderful to be back on the Stirring the Cauldron.
Well, you're a good stirrer, so it's good that you're back. Some people don't stir too well. They get a little nervous, but you're good with it. So listen, it's a common belief, well, at least in my circle, that places that are flooded with emotion are prime locations for hauntings, and prisons are high on that list due to the dangerous, threatening, cold-blooded nature of the inmates. But your book's dedication reminds us that it's not just murderers, rapists, and violent offenders who have left their mark in prison. There's also the justified anger and fear of those innocent men and women who were wrongfully incarcerated as well. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm guessing their energy may be a little bit stronger than the criminals themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely have to say that there's a lot of that going on. It really comes down to, they would have obviously a lot more pent-up hostility than anybody else. And I do make a disclaimer in the work saying that by no means am I condoning the actions of other people that do deserve to be incarcerated. I do come from a family of both lawyers and, shall we say, people on the other side. So I try to be as objective and unbiased as possible. I put my own research interest in the occult and paranormal merged with my degree in criminal justice, and this was the first book where I ever had the opportunity to combine both of those passions together.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of try to approach it as a scholar, unbiased, and say, well, what about the people who didn't deserve to be put away? And it very much made me think back on the Haunted Asylums book that came out last year, where I'm thinking about the treatment of the people that were there. Yeah, how awful would it be if you were locked up for possibly the rest of your life for something that you didn't do? I mean, how much hostility would have been built up within you during that entire time? And what about the people on death row? What if someone were, as the colloquial expression goes, shanked by an inmate and dies in a prison? Of course, they're going to have more rage than someone who just was a violent individual who deserved to be there and happened to die during a riot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I kind of think that people that were unlawfully or innocent people that were sent to prison and possibly died there. I mean, some probably got released, but some died. And then, same with asylums. Can you imagine being a normal person sent to an asylum? So it's the same type thing, that I think that anger has to be, that emotion, that hatred, all kinds of stuff coming out of them has to be a lot stronger than, your average criminal. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but...
No, I certainly would agree with that. And also keep in mind, it's not just the inmates. There were prison workers. The Folsom Prison, they have an entity that's documented there by one of the workers that tells the story, and it was in a book called The Folsom Phantom. And it was from a prison guard who was killed during a riot during the 1930s, and one of the wardens who was operating the prison during that time perished as well. So, there are cases of the guards who are just as trapped, repeating the same patterns in the afterlife that they, were used to during their life. So, it must have made a very profound impact on the lives of the people who worked there if, their residual energy is kind of on an ongoing, rotation, forever, continuing the same actions that they felt so passionate about while they were alive.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole, smorgasbord of things going on in penal institutions. I mean, you just think of, okay, here's, all the bad guys sitting there behind bars, but I mean, so much goes on. And I was, I did a little bit of digging, and I didn't realize this, but prisons, I mean, this is as far back as I could find, date back to ancient Greece. I mean, that far back, not just current.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of, okay, there's, in American history anyway, there's the old ghost towns and, the Wild Wild West and everything. And of course, Yuma Territorial Prison, built in 1876, it was actually built by the inmates themselves. They put them to work, and that was pretty common. They had to build their own stronghold, but at the same time, some of these places, they go back hundreds, if not, 1,000 years. Like ancient Rome, under the catacombs of the city, that's where dungeons were first imposed. I mean, the Code of Hammurabi dates back to, before the Common Era. So, this has been a necessary but soiled past of humanity. I mean, obviously we can't let criminals or insane people or someone who needs to be separated, sequestered away from the rest of society, we can't let them loose. But at the same time, we're only people, and sometimes we misjudge things. We either misjudge a medical diagnosis, or a jury of our peers aren't exactly our peers, or they're biased, or sometimes people get a harsher sentence than they deserve. So, we as a society have to be judged as humanity overall for how we treat our fellows. On one hand, we need to protect those around us. On the other hand, there's a very fine line between being the jailer and being just a stone's throw away from being just as guilty of the horrible atrocities man against man. The jailers themselves, the barbaric treatment that these people had to endure. Many of the prisons that I wrote about were shut down specifically for the very reason of how barbaric they were to the inmates. Moundsville, it was built on the remains of a Native American burial ground, and that kind of stood out to me, obviously, because part of my ancestry is Cherokee, and I'm thinking, well, someone obviously in the 1800s did not care about other cultures or burial rites or anything like that, and how could they not think that there would be a problem with this, even on a social economic wavelength, let alone on a Stephen King Pet Cemetery sort of consequences.
Why do you think that inmates remain bound to the prisons and some of the others as well after they've died, when most likely their spirits are free to go? I mean, here's people that have been incarcerated for years and years and years and miserable, and all of a sudden, technically, this is what people think, you pass on your spirits free, go, why do you think they hang out?
Well, even on a hypothetical situation, it's almost like if you're let's cite one of the prisons that I wrote about,
Okay.
One that Mr. Reverend Tim Shaw went to recently, and so many other paranormal enthusiasts. I believe it was where the Shaw. Yeah, Shawshank Redemption, was there being filmed as a matter of fiction, and that's what springs to my mind. Is if you remember the old man that he was institutionalized, he couldn't break away from that feeling, and he couldn't cope with real life. They become so used to set schedules, and the bells ring, and the guards herd them around. It's mealtime, whatever. They can't cope with their newfound freedom. So this old guy in the movie hung himself because he couldn't adapt back to the freedom. And who's to say that in cases like this that you're referring to, that these spirits don't move forward in these cases because they've become institutionalized, and even though they maybe at some level they know they're free to go but can't.
Yeah, scared to move on and scared of the unknown, as you said. It makes good sense. That's a very good answer, because I think a lot of people don't realize, unless you've seen Shawshank, which is such a good movie,
right.
that does happen.
Honestly, Shawshank and the Murder in the First with Kevin Bacon on Alcatraz, those are the things that kind of keyed my thinking into these places are despicable. What happened? And then as I kept digging, then I heard stories and guards and staff members at these places after they were turned into tourist attractions. They'll tell you stories that some of the retired guards have even written books specifically on the prisons they worked in the horror stories and ghost stories. I can't think other than asylums, honestly. And that's one reason why I kind of tried to pair these books together, even though they're through two different publishing companies. I wanted to prove a point that if there are any places in the world that should be haunted, it should be asylums and prisons because of conditions, short of anything else. So if there are, as Einstein said, energy is never created nor destroyed. If the energy that is us, when you see a dead body, and I don't mean to bog people down with just morbidity here, but when you see a dead body and it's someone that you personally know, it's not them anymore. When you look at them, the feel of who they are is gone. It's like a mannequin that's just cleverly made to look like them. And I think that what we're seeing and what we're not feeling is that energy that made them who they are, what they are. Their very presence around us, that we feel it even when they're in the same room with us and we're not even speaking. You get that vibe, and I think that's what's at least a portion of that energy is what remains behind. And some people can try to nitpick it. I mean, I'm not Brian Cano, so I don't know the science behind it, or I'm not a ghost hunter per se. I'm just a researcher, but this is my instinct talking. This is just me popping off a theory. But I think that is what we're feeling when we go into these buildings, and that's why they're so oppressive, is we're sensing that compounded collective consciousness of that feeling from everybody. We're not getting any one particular person unless it's in a room that's where an incident, a very big tragic incident may have occurred. But I'm speaking of the overall vibe of the building when you walk in.
I've been watching TV. We all do watch the paranormal shows, for example. And over the past decade, we've been familiarized with prisons like Eastern State and Alcatraz, but some of the others haven't been so widely televised. And one of them in your book caught my eye. I knew very little about Andersonville Prison, but in the book, I mean, it proves that it's very historically significant and apparently quite active to this day. So why don't you talk a little bit about Andersonville?
Well, Andersonville stood out to me simply because it was so different than all the others. It was during, it was a Confederate prison where the soldiers, I believe there was something like 35,000 people were incarcerated. And these weren't prisoners of war crimes. These were just regular soldiers, people's brothers, brothers and uncles and husbands. And, they were incarcerated. I mean, there were some violent people. If they weren't drafted into the war, they probably would have been criminals regardless. And some of them actually did spring up at this location. But out of the 45,000, 13 died for, untreated diseases. The sanitation conditions obviously were horrible. It was a camp turned into a prison, so it wasn't exactly built to even have the minimum of conditions that people needed to protect themselves from weather exposure. But there were a large number of hardened criminals called the Anderson Raiders, and they would prey upon their other fellow inmates because they wanted their clothing or whatever they had on them, and they would kill them if they didn't cooperate. So the group called the Regulators kind of got together, and they actually got police power by the head of the prison, no less. Not the guards, but the warden basically said, "Yeah, stick up for yourself." So they had a mock, I call it a mock, kind of a sham trial where the prisoners held the other prisoners accountable, and 6 of them were hung for their war crimes.
When you're talking about the warden, now, okay, so wardens in most prisons are often in office behind bars. They're safe for the most part. I mean, riots happen, but overall, they're in a position of safety. Now, someplace like Andersonville do you think, or do you know if the warden was on site? And if so, that would really kind of be a bonehead thing to do, don't you think? I mean, there's no safety there. Right.
I don't know per se if there was one person who was in charge there constantly, that was their command post. I'm not the Civil War buff that knows a ton about that particular location. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a lot of material on that particular one, but it stood out to me so much for being unique compared to all the rest. I felt obligated to put it in there.
Yeah.
I know in modern day, we have the cliche prison where they say we're going to send you to pound large boulders into small boulders, and you'll never get out, sort of thing for traitors in the current military. They put you in the stockades in the very least, but this was different. This was something that was just mass created in a very short time to house a lot of people. It was basically a fort that became a prison within its walls. So I think for them, it was more a matter of necessity, and they had someone in charge, and they would just kind of rotate people out of the position because, quite frankly, no one would want the job. They would want to be involved in the war and become, a hero and have some position of power and glory. Who wants to be? Oh, I was in charge of all the prisoners of war. It wasn't. It wasn't fantastic for their military resume, so to speak. So.
No, and if they hung around long enough, dysentery might have gotten them, and then there wouldn't have been any need for a resume, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a Civil War historian, so I unfortunately couldn't find out too much more other than, the obvious that there were phantom gunshots and voices of inmates that people could hear during, foggy conditions. You would see the apparitions of soldiers moving. But what was a little bit interesting that I never found anywhere else is that Father Whelan spirit was actually seen occasionally from investigators who was a priest who served the prison itself as the chaplain.
Wow.
You don't really find that too much mention of a chaplain at any of these places. Usually it's a guard, or most obviously it's the inmates themselves.
Yeah, that is interesting, but I guess he was very committed to what he was doing.
Right.
So he's still there. Good. All right, so most of the prisons we consider haunted are those that are no longer in operation, really. And there's so many across the country that stand abandoned. See, this is a curiosity to me. I mean, they're massive places for the most part. You would think that either they would be rebuilt or fixed up or something rather than closed, or turned into something else other than a prison. Did you come across the reason that so many of these were shut down and other prisons had to be built in their place rather than updating the existing ones?
I think it's because they were so antiquated that they had no choice than to build new facilities that were already larger.
Okay. No, I just, I'm thinking cost effective, what's worse, something new, but...
Right. I think it's a lot like the mental health problem, that it was so much easier to close down something that's been around since the Civil War. It's easier just to bulldoze, something else.
But the weird thing is that, so many are still standing. So, okay, they built something else, they moved prisoners over there. These massive, like, city-size buildings are still just standing there vacant.
Right.
That kind of blows my mind.
I agree. I mean, from a civilian point of view, we have things like Sing Sing, which is still a functioning prison, but we still have rooms that are, able to be turned into a museum. So I think there are some, but the modus operandi is usually just, we'll just level it or use it as a museum, sort of thing. From a taxpayer point of view, I'm going, why not make use of what's already here? I know it may be antiquated, but it can be modified and improved. I mean, nobody has ever escaped other than maybe two people in the entire history of Alcatraz, and I know that they need repairs because of the salt water and things like that, but, regular people aren't going to be able to chew through bars, so to speak. So I share your wonder about that.
It's just kind of amusing and amazing at the same time, because and a lot of them have been turned into museums. Like, I love the Old West. I really think I lived there once, 100 years, 200 years ago, whatever. So I enjoyed reading about the Yuma Territorial Prison. Now, that prison was only open for 33 years. But over 100 prisoners were said to have died there, and they have turned it into a museum. And one thing that I want to hear about is the dark cell at Yuma.
Well, I'd have to say that we had several cases where if someone was murdered in their cell, I've cited several of them in the book, but an inmate would be killed by another inmate most often, and you would feel the coldness in that particular cell, whereas others, even though they were constructed out of the same materials, clearly there's a temperature drop, and usually through thermal graphics and EVPs, that's where we find the most activity is in the same places that where historians will actually come in and say, that's where something took place.
Yeah, it just, when I looked at the pictures and stuff, I mean, I like I said, I have an affinity to the Old West, and it just like, even the name of it, the Yuma Territorial Prison, I mean,
Right.
it because back then it wasn't the city or the state or the government, it was all territory stuff.
Right.
And I think if people are familiar with Westerns and stuff, that, they had the guy, the judge, the traveling judge that came into town, in cycles and stuff. So, I mean, I'm sure that that prison probably has a lot of activity in it as well. Even as a museum, it's probably kept up pretty much in certain areas, pretty much the same way that it looked back then.
Right. It didn't have as much deterioration as some of the other ones, surprisingly. And I think maybe it's the environment, the dry heat, as opposed to,
damp and musty.
Yeah. The weather conditions of the environment are definitely going to give off a lot more. In some cases, it is going to fall apart more. Like that was one of the issues with Alcatraz, is the salt was eroding the steel and rusting everything, so it was no longer the fortress, and to maintain it would have cost more. Whereas in the desert, it's a dry heat, and people are so weighed down by that oppressive. We're experiencing pretty high temperatures all over the United States right now. Nobody feels very active, much less wanting to do a massive outbreak. Obviously, I have friends in law enforcement in my own hometown and in other states, and they'll sit there and they'll say, yeah, crime goes up during the summer because people are irritated, but if you're locked up in something made of cement or brick or steel and it is baking the heat in, and these places didn't have air conditioning, even the wealthy people during the frontier period, they didn't have anything like that. So, these are even worse conditions, so the inmates are, just kind of laggy. And, so I think that has a lot to do with it.
It probably does. And the interesting thing when you're saying that they don't have air conditioning and stuff, back then they didn't like walk around like we do today. They didn't wear tank tops and shorts. I mean, they all had jeans and flannel shirts and bandanas and hats and boots. I mean, they didn't dress for comfort, obviously.
Right.
And it's amazing to think that people actually lived through it. And we were allowed to be born from them being the ancestors, because who could live in the desert like that?
It's fascinating. I mean, one of the reasons why I love doing researchy type books is because I get to dig into the past in the Victorian period and the Renaissance and all these different cultures, the Old West, modernizing America, the industrial age. You get to almost get a glimpse of what it was like in the past.
Yes.
I remember just a few weeks ago, it wasn't a prison, obviously, but I was led on tour through Buffalo Terminal. And I mentioned to Tim that as he was taking me through, I was just kind of wide-eyed wondering. You could almost feel and hear part of the past replaying itself around you. I don't know if it was me picking up on something or I was just, daydreaming because it was so cool. But, where the newsy stand was and, in the main part of the terminal where people would disembark, you could almost see and feel the noise as if you were transported back in time. And that's what I love about writing, is even though I don't do a lot of fiction, when I'm researching the real things, you can almost pick up on that. You can visualize what was going on, especially if you're fortunate enough to find photographs of people from the time period. or if you like watching old westerns or black and white Humphrey Bogart movies, things like that. You can almost feel like you're there, especially when you go visit these places.
Yeah.
It's unreal, and to me, it's really cool. Maybe I'm just jaded and kind of spooky a human being, but I obviously can't be alone, or we wouldn't have millions of people that are willing to take their vacation time to go tour these places.
Yeah, you walk into, it's not just you or spooky. You seem to walk into somewhere that has a history or something, and a lot of the time it takes you out of the zone that you're in and kind of takes you back.
Right.
It just, there's something about certain surroundings, and I don't know if it's energy that's there from before, or some people are more sensitive than others. But you do. When people go on vacation, they get taken out of their mundane lives, everyday life, and all of a sudden, oh my God, I'm here, and this happened here, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and you do kind of feel it. You do. I mean, at least that's my experience. Maybe I'm as spooky as you. I don't know. But,
well, we're in good company then.
Yeah, it's just neat. Now, a great number of prisons buried many of their dead on site at the prisons in their own cemeteries. Do you know if some of those graveyards are still in existence at the locations that have been shut down for years? Was there any information about that?
Other than obviously the grounds where Moundsville is, I do believe that East State Penn still has a burial grounds there. That's a certain part of the prison you're not really supposed to go tramping through to disturb it. They do have a graveyard on the property, and that's why a lot of these places were made into landmark historic places, just like the asylums. You're not allowed to bulldoze a building if there's a cemetery on the property. It's a federal law. So that is probably
one of the reasons.
It's fortunately probably one of the reasons why we still have some of these old places to visit, is because of the respect for the dead that we have as a people. Of course, it doesn't stop the wealthy developers who are wanting to push and try to get these old places torn down so they can make yet another shopping mall or parking garage.
Exactly.
But that's a personal beef I have with some of the wealthy and powerful. There's plenty of land still left on the planet. We don't need to go knocking down places that have historic value where we can actually learn from our past mistakes.
Well, I tell you, that's one of my things that if you go over to Europe, you see buildings that are hundreds and sometimes thousands of years old, and in Asia, all the other countries of the world seem to revere their history and their ancestors, and anything here that's more than 75 years old, 100 years old, there's very few places that don't get bulldozed and turned into parking lots. And it's like we don't understand the history now in Hollywood. I mean, there are so many places that should not have gone.
Right.
The Gardens of Allah, where F. Scott Fitzgerald and so many stars hung out. I mean, they were apartments where they lived. Very, very famous in the 30s and 40s. Now it's a bank building and there's a plaque.
Because it's almost as if we don't care here. But you have to think that the United States is barely, 200 years old, whatever. So, Europe, they don't consider age, even if they're 500 to 1,000 years old. Their idea of what's old and nostalgic compared to here in the United States is not judged by a few hundred years, but by 1,000. Yeah. And I think it's that difference of a mentality that America, looking at the overall, we tend to be different in the mindset of how we do or don't appreciate history. And I think it's because, to be honest, I know that a lot of people quibble over this, but Australia and the United States was largely built on slavery from not only Africa, but immigrants from Ireland and China for the railroads. New York was built up a lot by the Irish. And they were, for all intents and purposes, the indentured servants were slaves. And then there were the prisoners who went to Australia and America from the old world. So, we have that diversity, but they were people trying to escape or sent away from where they were. It wasn't because, they loved the old world or they would have stayed there, So I think that mentality of the inmate or slave, they weren't here by their own choice. Oh, of course, you got the other people who came over here because they wanted a better life, and that's where we still have immigration today, is people trying to live the American dream. But that's not where most of our ancestry in this country came from.
Right. Yeah. I think it's such a shame because history doesn't mean a whole lot. And if all the other countries had taken that same thought thousands of years ago, there wouldn't be anything standing. There would be no historical monuments or places to visit and things. And I think I find that really sad. I'm glad that certain places here, like the battlefields, are safe. They're good to go. Places like Fort Mifflin, could actually not survive because it takes money to keep it up. But just looking around, and it doesn't matter. I seem to think that, and I haven't been traveling widely across the United States, but when I have been, the smaller towns seem to keep their history. They're not knocking down the old buildings to build new buildings. They're keeping the old ones, refurbishing them, and so you get a different sense of life, and people, I think, are different there than in a big city where it's like, okay, look, there's a chip on the corner of that building, tear it down, let's put up a prefab or something. That's kind of the way it works.
Hey, I remember that back when I first started writing for Shipper, I did Cemetery Gates. And it talked in the introduction about how we as a society, as we have advanced, we're different in mentality from Europe or small-town America. Once we reach the point where we're saturated with all the large cities and all our technology, our communication with each other is through Skype, Facebook, texting. We live in such a fast-paced society, and it's so high-tech. We don't care as much about each other, where it's not like, hey, the farmer that lived down the road or the small-town village, everybody knew everybody. That's almost gone now.
Yeah, we don't even know our neighbors, a lot of people.
Forget people that live in skyscrapers in multi-townhouse complexes. That's the same way in a small neighborhood in an average city like where I live. I know my neighbors across the street are monks and, the regular clergy and the people that own the property, but I've never once met the people on either side of my lot or the people behind me who, we all take our trash out, but we never see each other. We're always on the go. And, to be honest, if I didn't travel to go to conventions to, like Buffalo and Dragon Con that I just came back from, all these things back to back, I wouldn't actually meet people myself. I shop online. Or if I do go out, it's late at night, and, I avoid a lot of human contact. And, it's not that I don't care about people, it's that my life is so busy because I'm an author. I'm spending hour after hour every day either writing my own books or formatting other people's, and I do grow a little detached from the rest of humanity, so I can't imagine, how the rest of society functions, and yet they don't really connect with each other.
Do you think people are afraid of each other more so than 100 years ago?
I do. I mean, we had a little more violent of a society, and like you were saying, the gunslinging Old West, the gangster period, and I'm speaking of the 1920s, 1930s era. We didn't have our violence, obviously, but people were more connected to each other, and I think we've grown so detached over time that it's in part because of all the wars, it's all the political unrest, it's all the atrocities. We've become desensitized to each other's hurts and problems.
And suspicious.
We're always suspicious. We're cynical human beings because of our history, that we feel that we're safe because we close off.
Yeah, and that's really not a good thing. I don't think there's any solution for it, but it makes you wonder, It really,
It
really
does.
does. Hmm.
And I think that
Now,
sense of detachment is why we have prisons that are overflowing, is because, you've got kids that are growing up without parents in the split up homes, or,
hmm
the streets become the gangsters, families, and of course that's a bad influence. And,
hmm
it's a snowball effect that I don't know if there is a way to stop it other than individuals taking charge of their own lives one at a time.
yeah, but it's the last couple of generations seem to kind of have lost that. I mean, people aren't socialized anymore.
Right.
Because they have social media, because there's Twitter and Facebook and all that, they can talk to people all day long without knowing them. I mean,
Yeah.
no face to face, no pat on the back, no hugs, hello. It's just, and a lot of times you don't really know the person you're talking to, even though you think you do.
Right.
So yeah.
I meet lots of people through social media, and I've grown my fan base, and I really appreciate the advantages of technology.
Mhm.
I mean, I ship books all over the world, and I'm
Yeah.
really amazed at how fast it's grown. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I really like going to conventions because I'm able to meet people one on
Yes.
one and actually reach out. And the crowds at Dragon Con, when they lined up at the tables after each of my classes signing
Mhm.
books for them, I was happy just to meet them, even briefly, saying hi. Glad you came out. And they're like, well, we've been following you for years, and it was
Uh-huh.
the first chance they got to actually walk up to me and say, "Hey, would you sign this?" And that meant more to them individually than anything, and that's why I keep doing it.
Yeah, human contact is amazingly wonderful, and we should kind of remember that from now on.
We should. We should.
Uh-huh. All right, so if somebody offered you a luxurious night alone in any one of the prisons you wrote about in the book, which one would you definitely not go to?
Ooh, not go to. I was already thinking of the one I would.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I'm tricky like that. Yeah.
um, that's a tough one.
Mhm.
Because I found something fascinating about each of them,
Mhm.
uh, it made it very hard for me because I was intrigued by all of them.
Right.
But stay the night. I think East 8 probably has the most overwhelming sense of foreboding
Uh-huh.
out of everything, and yet that was the very first prison of any of these that I happened to go to myself.
Mhm. All right. Now because of who you are, um and you're into the dark culture, you're into all that kind of stuff. Personal question, do you scare easily?
No, I think partly because I'm enough of a skeptic
Uh-huh.
where I'm so curious of show me, prove to me, I want to know. But
Mhm.
then I'll just blindly charge in. I mean, I'll bring up the terminal again. I wandered a little away from the crowd, and I had to poke my head in one of the elevator shafts that didn't have glass in the door anymore. And I looked down, saw these rusted chains, and it went down 3 or 4 stories. And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's scary. That's why you're not supposed to do this." And so I am pretty jaded as a skeptic, but at the same time, I think that human curiosity factor of needing to know why, the very thing
Mhm.
that makes me a writer and researcher of trying to seek all these different answers out,
Right.
that's what keeps me from being too much afraid. I think a good dose of common sense of you should be afraid here
Mhm.
might kick in once in a while, but it's not the first go-to for me emotionally.
Well, Tim just wrote something in chat. He said, "Was he scared in my haunted office?"
No, actually, I feel very at peace there because
Okay.
it has a very warm sense of protection almost. I feel cozy, if that's the word, and partly that's Ebby's doing. But
Mhm.
you know, I don't know the presence of the owners. Whether they're home or not. I've always felt more like it was a second home to me uh, than anything at the Shaw's residence. So I'm not afraid at all. I mean, uh, yeah, I've never felt any sort of foreboding presence there, especially upstairs.
Well, good, because Tim is afraid of the dark. You know that, right?
I do know that he said that he keeps the lights on for a little, coziness, and TV going for the ambient sound, things like that. But
Oh, well, he just said that you just didn't know what was under the bed. So for next time, you might want to take a peek before you settle in.
Well, if he's got some skulls or some cremated remains, I'm still good, because at Michelle Bellinger's house, I've been over to her basement many times, and it's a humongous library, and she has the remains of a serial killer ashes in a canister.
Oh, lovely.
So it's just sitting on a shelf. Yeah, it's their name's Jane or something like that, and it's like, "Hi, Jane," walk by. So yeah, I don't get scared too easy.
All right, that's good. Well, our time is running out, so I want a couple things. What are you going to be up to in the next couple of weeks, or few weeks, or month or so?
I'm actually really, really busy. September and October, it's like been a whirlwind for the last 2 or 3 months, but it's just continually picking up. I've got multiple radio interviews. I will be going on the 20th and 21st up to Hell, Michigan for the Hearst Fest. And right after that, on that following Sunday, I'll be making an appearance at the Unity Tree, thanks to our lovely host, Deb. And the week after that, I'll be at the Dark History Con. I believe it's Illinois. I'm getting bad at keeping up on everything. I just kind of look at it last minute and go, "Ooh, I need to buy a new plane ticket." And it's that one's focusing on serial killers and haunted places and gangster memorabilia. So I've got that on the 26th. We're doing a second trailer filming this month for Eerie America, because Destination America, which is owned by Discovery Channel, wants to see a second trailer that focuses less on the places we're going, because they're already sold up the concept. They want to see more in-depth on the characters, to see if we're strong enough as the trio to be willing to greenlight the show. So we should know by Halloween or before if we're greenlit.
Oh, well, that's exciting. It's very exciting. I got to interject here. We got a comment from Moofy in the chat room. She wrote, "Okay, which serial killer? He can't just let that hang out there. Do you know whose ashes they were?"
I don't. You'd have to get a hold of Michelle Bellinger on Facebook or Twitter and ask her. I just kind of... She poisoned her family because they were being a problem for her, and she didn't want to deal with them anymore, and she was in the Ohio area. That much I remember.
Okay, well, Moof, if you're going to be a sleuth, then check that out. Serial killer who poisoned their family. Female, obviously, right?
Yeah, it was very much like the arsenic and old lace sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, she just wrote, "You didn't ask." I guess
I'm so used to Michelle and all the rest of my friends who are into this sort of thing. We're like, "Oh yeah, there she is." We don't even think about it. We're I guess that makes us more like the Addams Family than your common person out there.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm like that too.
That's my charm of life.
Where can people find out more about you, your books, your events, Dark Moon Press? Give me some websites.
To find out more about what I'm doing, obviously follow me on Facebook. I'll post randomly, where I'm going to be at. But if you want a complete listing that I have to update and adjust a little bit, CorvisNocturnum.com. There's actually a tab for appearances on there to check out that I keep trying to add to. I mean, I've got things booked all the way until February of next year. Then the darkmoonpress.com, you can purchase most of my books there, or if you want to get some of them written under E.R. Bernor through Shipper, you can either go to Shipper Publishing's website or, of course, Amazon. A lot of people just want to shop on Amazon because it's more convenient for them. You guys, if you want to purchase any of my work for the rest of the year, if you purchase any one book straight through me, I'll not only autograph it, but you'll get a second book of your choice for half cover price.
Good deal. Well, we have to boogie on out of here, so thank you so much for visiting, and always a pleasure, and always interesting enough to say, come back again.
Well, thank you, Marla. I really appreciate it.
All right, and everybody, thank you all for listening as well, and until next time, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2013. Moonlight Haw by Kevin MacLeod, licensed through Incompetech.com.